Welcome back to The Culture for another YouTube video. Before we go anywhere with today's video, where we're going to be discussing some musculature and squat outcomes, I want to talk about two big announcements that we have coming up over the next couple months. The first one is the Coach Development Program, which is our 12-month mentorship. This will be the third intake of the Coach Development Program. We had two last year in the COVID year. Things went really well for it, so we're really excited for this third intake, which is the first one for 2021. It kicks off on May the 10th, and it will be the first link in the bio down below. 12 weeks, everything that we know about training, strength training, powerlifting, movement, everything related to all of those topics is within this course, and you really do come out better understanding everything you need to know to excel as a coach in the industry. So we'd highly recommend checking it out. Again, first link in the bio. The second big announcement is that Melbourne Strength Culture, as you know it, is moving. We have secured a new location just a couple hundred meters down the road, a bigger facility, more office spaces, a bigger, better shaped gym. We're dumping a whole lot of resources into the creation of this facility, not just for a fantastic gym and to continue growing what we do from the gym front, but also from a content front. Donnie, we want to get him on with more hours per week, and part of that is he needed an office. So we've got him this huge, massive office to work out of. He's laughing there, but it's true. We do want to take our content to another level. Again, we've really pushed these last 6 to 9 months. We've felt the growth. We know you guys have been enjoying it, so it's time to go again. So we've got a huge creative space. We've got a podcast, glass-walled studio coming through. And really the opportunities are endless for what we can do out of that space. And we want to shake up the S&C and strength industry of Australia with that new space. So we're excited, and I'm sure you will too. It's looking like early July we'll be in there for everybody that has been asking. So we cannot wait, and keep an eye out for it. But today, let's talk about just some random facts about the squat, why the hamstrings don't really do anything in the squat, why the adductors are sort of the missing piece that a lot of people forget about, and how the glutes actually control and extend the hip throughout the squat. So before we go anywhere, we need to understand some key anatomy, some key actual structural considerations for how we extend the hip during a squatting pattern. And again, a squatting pattern is simply just where the knees and the hips are both flexing and then extending simultaneously, where a hinge pattern, a typical hinge pattern, is more of a hip dominant movement. A squat pattern provides both hip and knee flexion at the same time. So the first muscle that we have to look at here is the hamstring. And the hamstring, we can tell, it attaches on what's called the ischial tuberosity, which is sort of like your sit bones, and it crosses the entire length of the femur down behind the knee. So it's called a biarticulate muscle, which means it crosses two bi joints, biarticulate muscle. And biarticulate muscles behave and act in a very specific way when we discuss human movement in closed chain environments. So that's the first group that we have to understand. The second group that we have to understand is the glutes. And the glutes, we know, sort of encase the pelvis and they attach very proximally, just a little bit on the lateral side of the hip here. And as a result of their attachment points, we know that they are very powerful and strong hip extensors. The hip thrust has created a worldwide dominance of glute-driven exercises, as well as aesthetics and probably just Instagram culture as a whole. But the difference between the hamstring being a biarticulate muscle that crosses the hip and crosses the knee, compared to the glute, which only crosses the hip and attaches very proximally, is that the glute has heaps of leverage to actually close that hip into hip extension and to get the leg back behind us. Then we have one final muscle group, which is what we would call the adductor group, but for this topic specifically, we're going to be discussing the Adductor Magnus, which is one of the 5 main adductors of the hip. And the Adductor Magnus attaches medially, so on the inside of our groin, and attaches down the length of the femur. So we have attachment points along pretty much the whole length of the femur. And the adductor magnus can act in two key ways. When the hip is flexed and forward, it can extend the hip. And when the hip is behind us, it can actually flex the hip. Or when the femur is behind us, sorry, it can actually flex the hip forward as well. So depending on the relative position on the bones, we may get two different actions out of the adductor magnus. So three main muscles that we need to understand for hip extension. I discussed the key difference between the glute max and the hamstring. The glute max was more proximal. The hamstring is a biarticulate muscle that crosses both joints. Let's compare now the hamstring and the adductor magnus. We know that they attach at relatively similar areas up on the pelvis, up near the ischial tuberosity. However, with the hamstring being biarticulate, so it crosses both joints, this is just not the case for the adductor magnus. The adductor magnus, crosses down to the femur and along pretty much the full length of the femur, but it never actually crosses the knee. So it doesn't have any play on knee flexion or extension, which is the important thing to now consider for the final piece to this understanding. Donnie, can you see this in the screen? I've got the thumbs up. This is our torso as we come down into the squat. So we think about it as we're descending. This would be my rib cage here. My head would be here, like that. Very extended, but that's all right. If we draw the hamstring down here, we know that the hamstring here attaches up on the proximal hip at the ischial tuberosity, and it comes down and attaches behind the knee. And again, it crosses the knee joint. So what we see here is as the pelvis comes down and we actually descend down into the squat, the knees flex, the hips flex, we actually don't see any relative change of the length of the hamstring. It's only very minuscule. It doesn't actually go through a stretching moment. And we know that muscles like to stretch before they contract. So if it never goes through a true stretching moment because it crosses both joints, and whilst they're flexing, they can't get tension on the muscle belly itself, it's never going to be in a position to then contract and produce force on the way up. If we compare that to the glute, which is as we're coming down into the squat, it's going to be stretched more and more throughout the descension of the squat because the glute only crosses the one joint. So if it only crosses one joint, as that joint flexes, that extensor muscle is going to get length on the other side of it. So we're putting length into the glute. Depending on your stance will depend on how much length and how much tension we can actually generate with our glutes. But for the most part, if we flex the hip, the glute in some line of pull is going to get length on it. And now we can start to see how the adductor magnus is going to be probably the next most important muscle when we discuss the glute and the hamstring in terms of hip extension. The reason being is the adductor magnus is actually going to get tension when we move through hip flexion. So on the inside of this leg, we're going to have a muscle that only crosses the hip joint, and when it flexes, it's getting length in the extensor heads of the adductor magnus to then extend the hip on the way up. And this is really well supported in research as well. I'll get Donnie to put my favorite graph to explain this here. And then also we can look at a fantastic article by Greg Nuckols that I'll throw in the description box below. With hamstrings are they're sort of like the problem child of the squat. They don't really do a whole lot in terms of force production. They do help us, quote unquote, stabilize the hip and the knee and allow us to adequately transfer force through those joints and control some of the relative positions of those joints. But ultimately, the adductor magnus is going to be doing a majority of our deep hip flexion extension, and the glute max is going to be doing a majority of our terminal hip extension, which is sort of that last 30 to 60 degrees of hip extension is going to be dominated by the glute max, where everything below that is really going to be adductor magnus driven, with the hamstrings not really playing a whole lot of contribution in the hip extension when we talk about a squat mechanic, which is the hip and the knee flexing and extending at the same time. Hopefully my 2-year-old drawings and my explanation helped you better understand this. If you have any questions related to this, please let us know. Happy to discuss this stuff further. Just on this as well, it's probably why when you have taken some time off squatting and you go and do some squats for the first time in a little bit of a while, in a hot minute, your adductors in your inner thighs are quite often the thing that is limiting your recovery in the following days. It's never your hamstring. Sometimes it's your quads, sometimes it's your glutes, but it's probably always going to be your adductors, because this is one of the key ways in which we can drive adductor tension, adductor hypertrophy, and ultimately adductor gains. So it's probably why you feel your adductors after doing squats after a little bit of a hiatus from a holiday or some time off. So hopefully this helps. And again, if you have any questions, let us know. Just a reminder that the CDP is open. It is the first link in the bio down below. And other than that, happy lifting, and we'll see you next time.